Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are attempting something, well, pretty monumental, actually. We're trying to pull back the curtain on maybe the most celebrated naval figure in history, Horatio Nelson.
It's a big task.
It really is. We want to look past the marble statues, the heroic myths, the sheer national glory surrounding him to try and understand the complex, the contradictory, and the fiercely ambitious man who really became the embodiment of sea power.
That's exactly right. And our main guide for this journey is Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan. His biography of Nelson, it's not just a list of battles, it's this deep dive into his psychology, his strategy.
Right.
Mahan's goal was pretty strict. He wanted Nelson himself, through his huge volume of letters and his actions, he wanted Nelson to describe himself. Mahan said his core task, his necessity, was disengaging the figure of the hero from the glory that cloaks it.
And that's basically our mission for you, the listener, today, to try and get a really informed, nuanced picture of Nelson's character, his, unique strategic genius, and also those personal dramas, let's be honest, that often seem like they could derail his public triumphs.
Yeah, and Mahan argues pretty convincingly, I think, that if you look closely, his inner life and his external actions, they're just completely tied together. You can't separate them.
So where does that link start? What's the source?
Well, if you trace it back, Mahan finds this single, almost obsessive motivation behind nearly everything Nelson did. It's this idealized idea, this concept that kept popping up for him. Sometimes it looked like ironclad duty.
Okay.
Other times it was more like burning honor or renown.
Fame? That was the engine, wasn't it? His internal compass. There's that amazing quote he shared with Captain Hardy right before Trafalgar. A moment he's thinking about his own death, his legacy.
Yeah, it's incredible, he said to Hardy. In my mind's eye, I ever saw a radiant orb suspended which beckoned me onward to renown. This sort of celestial vision of distinction, of fame, of being acknowledged, that was the fuel. It wasn't just about winning battles.
Wow.
No, it was about making sure he was seen winning them, recognized for it, remembered.
And that pursuit of the radiant orb, that's what we're going to unpack today. How this burning ambition drove his incredibly rapid rise, how it justified moments where he just flat out defied his superiors, how it shaped his unmatched strategies, and how it played a big part in his most famous, maybe infamous personal controversies.
So let's start at the beginning. Let's try and understand the foundation that ambition was built on.
Okay, let's dig into his early life. You can't really talk about Nelson's career without, acknowledging he had a bit of a leg up at the start. He had Captain Suckling, his uncle, who was controller of the Navy.
That connection was definitely important, yeah. It helped get him an acting appointment as a lieutenant when he was just 18, which was really young.
18? Yeah. He got posted straight away to the Wester, a 64-gun ship. And this is what Mahan really emphasizes, and it's crucial for understanding Nelson. While his uncle opened the door, Nelson's own ability, his capacity, basically slammed it shut behind him.
Yeah.
He proved his worth almost immediately.
So he wasn't just riding on coattails. He actually recorded that, despite being so young, his captain on the Worcester felt, quote, as easy when I was upon deck as any officer of the ship.
Which is huge praise for a teenager back then. It shows he had this innate command presence, this professional competence right from the off.
But it was a specific kind of competence, wasn't it? There's that really interesting point from Admiral Codrington, who knew him well.
Yeah, Codrington, who admired him greatly, made this really stunning observation later on. He said, Lord Nelson was no seaman. Even in the earlier stages of the profession, his genius had soared higher, and all his energies were turned to becoming a great commander. Wait a minute, no seaman? We're talking about arguably the greatest naval hero ever? And an admiral says he wasn't a good seaman. What does that even mean in the, 18th century Navy context?
Well, it doesn't mean he couldn't, tie a knot or navigate. It means his focus, his real drive, wasn't about mastering the ship itself.
Yeah.
The really intricate technical bits of handling sails in a gale or getting the absolute maximum speed out of the hull.
Okay.
His genius was already aimed higher, at the larger strategic picture. How to maneuver the whole fleet, how to inspire the men, understanding the mission objectives, seizing the initiative as a commander. Mahan kind of suggests that while he had the basics of seamanship, his energy just shot past that necessary groundwork and went straight to thinking like a general, but at sea.
So, a born leader, not just a technician.
Yeah.
Like a CEO from day one almost.
Pretty much. And he made his mark fast. He got transferred to the Bristol Sir Peter Parker's flagship. And there, he went from third lieutenant to first lieutenant in just a couple of months. Now, some of that was the high turnover during the American Revolutionary War, but
not all of it.
No, definitely not. It was really cemented by what Mahan calls his singular faculty for enlisting the love and esteem of all with whom he was brought into contact. He just had this magnetism, even then as a young man. And the affection people felt for him was deep, and it lasted.
You see that clearly with Sir Peter Parker. Right. He and his wife basically took him in, looked after him when he was seriously ill.
Yeah, and decades later, after Nelson had won these huge victories at St. Vincent and the Nile, Lady Parker wrote to him saying they'd always thought of him as a son. That's way beyond just professional respect. That's real, deep, almost parental feeling.
And this knack for inspiring confidence, attachment, it wasn't just his bosses who felt it. It was his peers, too, like Cuthbert Collingwood.
Absolutely. Collingwood maintained this relationship of respect and veneration for Nelson throughout their entire careers, even though they were rivals in some ways. This ability to win trust, maybe his greatest tactical asset after raw courage.
And winning the confidence of superiors. Man, he got a lot of rope, didn't he? Mahan tells that story about the jealous captain.
Oh, yeah, that's very telling. This other captain basically complained to Nelson, saying something like, "You did just as you pleased in Lord Hood's time. The same in Admiral Hotham's, and now again with Sir John Jervis. It makes no difference to you who is commander-in-chief."
Wow.
It suggests Nelson's confidence, combined with the fact that he got results, made his superiors trust his independent judgment so much that he kind of operated outside the usual rules. He just did what he thought was best.
But his early years during the American Revolution, they weren't all action and glory, were they?
Yeah.
He spent a lot of time on routine stuff, convoy duty, missed the big fleet battles.
Right, and that period really throws Nelson's motivation into sharp contrast with, well, what drove many of his contemporaries, which is often prize money, making a fortune.
Ah, yes. The rejection of riches. Tell us about that convoy duty incident.
Okay, so he was on convoy duty near New York, and he got orders to basically wait there. Now, staying put was actually better for him financially. It gave him more freedom to capture enemy merchant ships' prizes without having to share the prize money with the main fleet, which was the rule if you were operating directly under the admiral. He even said it was much to my private advantage.
But he didn't take it.
Nope. He chose to sail with the fleet, even though it meant less potential cash for him personally. He wrote about the atmosphere there with real disdain, saying, "Money is the great object here, nothing else is attended to." That whole motive, chasing wealth, he always rejected with disdain, even though, ironically, he was often short of money himself because he was incredibly generous, apparently quite lavish.
For his integrity, his honor, that was his real currency.
That was everything. It was the foundation. He reflected after the war ended, having made no fortune, he wrote, "I have closed the war without a fortune, but I trust that there is not a speck in my character. True honor, I hope, predominates in my mind far above riches."
That distinction is absolutely key, isn't it? His wealth wasn't gold, it was glory. And that pursuit of honor, that spotless character, that's what gave him the confidence, maybe the justification in his own mind for the huge risks he'd take later, betting everything on his own judgment.
And that foundation of honor got tested immediately after the war when he was posted to the Caribbean in the mid-1780s. This was peacetime, technically, but it came with a very specific job, protecting British commerce.
And this is where he runs into his first major career crisis, that whole confrontation over the Navigation Act and the American traders. What was the deal there?
Okay, so after the American Revolution, the U.S. colonies were now foreign countries, which meant, under British law, the old Navigation Acts applied to them. These were protectionist laws, basically saying British trade had to be carried in British ships. Nelson saw it as his absolute duty as a naval officer, even in peacetime, to enforce these laws to the letter.
But the locals didn't like that. Or his boss.
Exactly. The local British governors, the planters, the merchants in the West Indies, they depended heavily on trade with the Americans for things like food supplies, lumber, and his superior, Admiral Hughes, well, he sided with the locals. They preferred to just relax the act, use their discretion, allow this technically illicit but necessary trade to continue.
So Nelson's caught in the middle. Obey the admiral on the spot, or obey the laws of Parliament back in London.
A classic dilemma, a profound conflict of loyalties. And what does young, zealous Captain Nelson choose?
Knowing Nelson, I'm guessing Parliament.
You got it. He chose Parliament over his immediate commanding officer. He basically concluded, I must either disobey my orders or disobey acts of Parliament. He decided to disobey the admiral, trusting, as he put it, to the uprightness of my intention. I mean, this is the kind of move that could end a career right there, especially for a captain who's still kind of relied on patronage
It takes some serious conviction, or maybe arrogance, to decide you know the law better than the admiral and the king's attorney general on the island. He wasn't quiet about it either, was he?
Not at all, he bluntly stated. How the king's attorney general conceives he has a right to give an illegal opinion, which I assert the above is he must answer for. I know the navigation laws.
Ooh.
Mic drop.
Wow.
So this defiance, it set this crucial precedent for his whole career. It showed that for Nelson, the abstract idea of duty, his idealized duty to the crown and the nation, it trumped the actual functional chain of command if he thought that chain was acting illegally or, against the true national interest. He risked being sued. He faced huge potential fines from the merchants whose ships he seized.
And the risk was serious. But he won, didn't he? The Admiralty backed him up in the end.
They did. His conduct was eventually approved, and the crown even paid his legal fees to defend him against the merchants' lawsuits. It was a huge victory, and it really solidified his reputation, at least in some circles, as this guy who would take massive personal risks to uphold what he believed was right. Duty above all.
Now, while all this intense duty stuff is going on, we get this really interesting little glimpse of his personality before he became truly famous. People on the island found him, well, not exactly charming.
Right. He was described as taciturn, reserved, stern, not the flamboyant character we often picture later. He sounded like he was totally focused on his job, on that radiant orb, maybe not that interested in the local social scene.
There's that letter that described his reserve and sternness, with occasional sallies, though very transient, of a superior mind. And they wondered if his future wife, Frances Nisbet, could make something of him.
Yeah, for you have been in the habit of attending to these odd sort of people. It's a pretty brutal description. He was seen as this kind of professional ascetic, maybe? An oddball among the planters and officials?
Still, he marries Frances Nisbet, who was a widow with a young son, in Nevis in 1787. And even his wedding had a touch of his rising star about it.
That's right. Prince William Henry, who later became King William IV, was there serving in the Navy. He insisted the wedding be delayed until he could get there to give the bride away, a sign of the connections Nelson was already making.
But that marriage happened just as things were getting tense in Europe again. And Nelson was desperate for action.
Oh, yeah. He wrote, "I begin to think I am fonder of the sea than ever." He was practically itching for a war, for that chance to gain renown.
But instead of action, he gets sent back to England for a job he hated, the impress service, forcing sailors into the Navy. And it separated him from his new wife.
Right, and this period brings up a really, really important point Mahan makes about Nelson's health and his psychology.
The connection between action and well-being.
Exactly. Nelson often complained about his health fevers, anxiety, feeling low, especially when he was stuck in port or doing boring routine duty. But during this active, even though unpleasant, impress service, his health actually improved. He noticed it himself later, saying something like, "To say the truth, when I am actively employed, I am not so bad."
So idleness literally made him sick. His mind, maybe his body too, just demanded that constant pursuit of the orb.
It really seems that way. And this period, even doing a job he disliked, it also showed another side of him, pushing back against the idea that he was just a naval officer. He managed to get this crucial meeting at 6 a.m. no less with George Rose, the Secretary of the Treasury.
6 in the morning with a top Treasury guy? What was that about? Not ship reports, presumably.
No, it was about the widespread fraud he'd uncovered in the West Indies, linked to those trade practices he'd fought against earlier. Rose was apparently a bit cool at first, just another captain with complaints. But the meeting, planned for a quick chat, lasted 3 hours until 9 o'clock.
Wow. So Nelson impressed him.
Hugely. Rose wrote later that Nelson showed this precise knowledge of several political subjects connected with the commerce of the country. He wasn't just talking naval matters. He was talking like economic policy, colonial administration, the bigger strategic picture of trade.
That's fascinating. So he had this wider grasp all along.
Exactly. Rose thought Nelson's views were spot on, really judicious. It proved Nelson had this practical political sense, this intellectual depth way beyond just being a good sea captain. Mahan uses this to argue that the statesman side of Nelson was there long before he commanded fleets. And this deep understanding of trade, of national interest, that's probably what fueled his absolute certainty during the Navigation Act fight. He wasn't just following rules blindly. He believed he understood the purpose behind them.
Okay, so war finally breaks out with revolutionary France in 1793. This is when Nelson really steps onto the main stage, isn't it? The period where, as Mahan puts it, expectation passed into fulfillment. And it's all tied up with his command of HMS Agamemnon.
The Agamemnon, yeah, that ship was like his home for 3 critical years. And it tells you a lot about him that he clung to that ship. He kept refusing promotions that would have put him on bigger, more powerful ships. He only left when the hull was literally worn out from service.
Why would he do that? Wouldn't a bigger ship, a bigger command lead to more glory, more renown?
Well, Mahan suggests Nelson focused this incredibly intense interest and influence just on the Agamemnon. It was like a perfect little world for his command style. He could pour his will, his sense of duty, his urgency into every single man on board. If he'd been commanding a whole squadron or fleet then, maybe that intense personal connection gets diluted.
So the Agamemnon was like his laboratory for perfecting the Nelson touch on a smaller scale.
Kind of, yeah. And he put that focus straight to work in the campaigns in Corsica. He was often involved in operations with the army, acting almost like a land commander sometimes.
Like at the Siege of Bastia in 1794.
Right. Nelson was told the French garrison had about 4,500 troops. He landed with under 1,200 troops and seamen. I mean, by the usual military calculations, they should have been wiped out. But they somehow forced the French to surrender.
And his reaction to that surrender says a lot about his mindset, his national pride.
He was genuinely astonished. He called it the most glorious sight that an Englishman can experience, and which I believe none but an Englishman could bring about. He seemed to think the victory wasn't just about courage, but about some kind of inherent British moral superiority. He suspected the French troops didn't trust each other, which led to them folding quickly.
Then later that year, at Calvi, he's fighting ashore again. And that's where he lost the sight in his right eye.
Yeah, took a hit from debris kicked up by cannon shot during the siege. So these weren't just, naval bombardments from a distance. He was right there, involved in the Army's ground operations.
But this period wasn't just about his own bravery, was it? It was also marked by frustration with his superiors, particularly Admiral Hotham.
Oh, definitely. During these partial fleet actions in 1795, Nelson was constantly pushing against Hotham's very cautious, almost passive approach.
What was Hotham doing wrong in Nelson's eyes?
Mahan calls it inertness. Hotham basically failed to chase the French fleet aggressively after a couple of skirmishes. He let them get away, repair, regroup. Nelson was apparently furious about this later, arguing that if Hotham had just kept pressing the attack, the British could have prevented the invasion of Italy by cutting off French sea communications and supplies.
So this really highlights the clash between the old-school naval thinking, keep your own fleet intact, maybe fight to a draw, and Nelson's emerging idea of total annihilation.
Exactly. And you see Nelson's approach crystal clear when he gets his own detached squadron command along the Riviera of Genoa. He just poured everything into it. Total focus. He wrote, "I have not a thought on any subject separated from the immediate object of my command. Just complete single-minded commitment."
And this commitment came with a philosophy about seizing opportunities, right?
Yeah.
Not waiting for the perfect plan.
Yeah, that's summed up in that famous line of his. A sea officer cannot, like a land officer, form plans. His object is to embrace the happy moment which now and then offers. It may be this day, not for a month, and perhaps never.
That feels like a really key insight into naval warfare versus land warfare. A general can often pick the battlefield, set things up, but at sea, you're dealing with wind, weather, the enemy's choices.
Precisely. Nelson got that naval planning had to be flexible, adaptable, ready to pounce instantly when that brief happy moment appeared. Maybe the enemy makes a mistake, maybe the wind shifts in your favor. That idea, seizing the moment for decisive action, that's what we'll see later at St. Vincent and ultimately at Trafalgar.
So his command on the Riviera involved a lot of grinding work against French coastal shipping. Sounds a bit tedious, but strategically vital.
Absolutely crucial. Those little coastal ships, the coasters, they were the lifeline supplying Napoleon Bonaparte's army, which was just starting its campaign in Italy. By constantly attacking and disrupting that traffic, Nelson was directly hurting the French war effort on land. His strategic view was already linking sea control to the Continental War.
And he was seeing patterns, too. You mentioned he gave an early warning about French plans near Leghorn in '96 that kind of foreshadowed Napoleon's big plan in 1805.
Yeah, Nelson spotted the French using a diversionary tactic. They made moves to draw the British fleet north, away from their real target near Leghorn in Italy. He saw this pattern using a distant feint to create a local advantage, and recognized it as a precursor to the much grander diversion Napoleon tried in 1805, sending Villeneuve across the Atlantic to draw the Royal Navy away from the English Channel.
His star was definitely rising. He gained the respect of the new commander-in-chief, Sir John Jervis, the future Earl St. Vincent. Jervis even asked him to stay on as a Commodore after Nelson was promoted to Rear Admiral, which was a huge compliment.
It was, but even as his public stock was soaring, those private insecurities were still there. Mahan notes that during quiet periods in port, Nelson would just intensely brood over the neglect he felt he'd received from Lord Hood in the official reports about his service in Corsica.
There's that duality again. The relentless, hyper-focused commander on deck, but also this deeply sensitive guy off-duty, desperate for praise and recognition.
Lord Radstock nailed it when he said, "A perpetual thirst of glory was ever raging within him." It wasn't just simple vanity, Mahan argues. It was this fundamental psychological need for his efforts, his sacrifices, to be fully acknowledged. And this sensitivity made him fiercely defensive of his reputation. When someone criticized his integrity while he was on the Riviera Command, he fired off this incredibly forcible letter repudiating an attack, basically daring the accuser to prove it.
He could not tolerate any speck on that character he'd guarded so carefully since his youth. That sense of honor was absolutely central to his being.
And that fiercely defended honor, that reputation, it creates ultimate validation at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent in February 1797. This is really the moment Nelson transforms from a highly respected, professionally distinguished officer into a genuine national hero.
This is the ultimate happy moment seize, wasn't it? It involved that signature Nelson move, disobeying orders for a greater goal. He was in the rear of the British line.
That's right. Commanding HMS Captain, third from the rear, he saw the much larger Spanish fleet trying to join its separated divisions. If they managed that, the British under Jervis would be badly outnumbered. Seeing disaster coming, Nelson did something extraordinary. He steered his ship out of the British line of battle on his own initiative.
Just broke formation. That was against every rule in the book.
Completely against the rigid tactical doctrine of the time, which demanded you keep that line intact at all costs for mutual support. It was blatant tactical insubordination, done, as Mahan stresses, openly under the eyes of all men. He risked court-martial. He risked his ship being isolated and destroyed.
But it worked spectacularly.
It did. He threw his ship right into the path of the leading Spanish vessels, including their huge flagship, the Santísima Trinidad. He engaged them, boarded, and captured 2 major Spanish ships himself, leading the boarding parties in what became known as Nelson's patent bridge for boarding enemy vessels, using one captured ship to board the next. Jervis, the C&C, saw the genius of the move instantly. He embraced Nelson on the deck afterwards, saying he couldn't thank him enough.
Instant transition to national renown. But almost immediately that fragile ego pops up again, doesn't it? The controversy with Vice Admiral Parker over Nelson's account of the battle.
Yeah, Nelson's published account kind of implied that the leading ships of the British van, Parker's division, weren't close enough to support him when he made his move, which wasn't entirely fair or accurate. Mahan points out Nelson's narrative was somewhat exultant. It showed his tendency to frame events around his own decisive action, sometimes glossing over the contributions of others. That radiant orb needed to shine brightest on him.
So, St. Vincent cements his professional fame. But then comes a major personal and professional blow. The disastrous attack on Santa Cruz de Tenerife later that same year, 1797, where he lost his arm.
Tenerife. Yeah, a crushing failure. And the contrast Mahan draws here is really telling, especially comparing Nelson's instinct for decisive action with Captain Truebridge, who was actually one of Nelson's most trusted and capable subordinates. Truebridge led the landing parties ashore.
But he hesitated.
He failed to immediately seize the heights overlooking the town and the fort. He waited for the Admiral Nelson to arrive and give specific orders.
The very thing Nelson didn't do at St. Vincent, Truebridge did at Tenerife.
Exactly. And that hesitation, waiting for orders instead of acting on the immediate tactical necessity, it cost them crucial time. It allowed the Spanish defenders to regroup, and it led directly to the failure of the whole assault. Mahan uses this to highlight Nelson's characteristic eminence, the difference between a truly great captain who sees his responsibility in a crisis and a merely accomplished, brave officer who follows the rules and waits for direction.
The psychological impact of that failure, plus losing his right arm, must have been immense. He sounded utterly defeated in his letters.
He really did. He felt he was finished. He wrote to Jervis, "I am become a burthen to my friends and useless to my country. I go hence and am no more seen." Just total despair.
His mentor, St. Vincent, Jervis, tried to rally him, didn't he?
Yeah, St. Vincent wrote back with that classic military stoicism. Mortals cannot command success. You and your companions have certainly deserved it by the greatest degree of heroism and perseverance. Basically, you did your best. Sometimes you lose.
But as Nelson recovered physically, this professional low point coincided with the beginning of something else, didn't it? The serious blot upon his memory, as Mahan puts it. His relationship with Emma, Lady Hamilton, really takes off in Naples after his next great victory, the Battle of the Nile in 1798.
Right. Mahan is pretty blunt about this. He argues Nelson found in Lady Hamilton something he desperately needed and felt he wasn't getting from his wife, Lady Nelson. And that was admiration and appreciation, undisguised and unmeasured. She just showered him with the adoration, the public recognition that fed that deep psychological craving he had.
He seemed to completely idealize her, didn't he? Calling her one of the very best women in this world. Seems like his usually sharp analytical mind just short-circuited when it came to her. Fell into this delusion.
It really does look that way. He seemed aware of the danger on some level, though. He wrote this incredibly revealing line to St. Vincent from Naples. Naples is a dangerous place, and we must keep clear of it. Wise words. But then he immediately adds, almost laughing at himself, I am writing opposite Lady Hamilton. Therefore, you will not be surprised at the glorious jumble of this letter.
That glorious jumble kind of sums up the whole period, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because this intense personal involvement, this infatuation, it led to some really questionable strategic decisions in 1799, especially regarding the Kingdom of Naples.
Absolutely. Urged on by the Queen of Naples, who was Emma Hamilton's close friend, and by Emma herself, Nelson threw his weight behind this really premature Neapolitan army advance against the French occupying forces.
Against better military advice.
Completely against prudent military advice. It wasn't a happy moment to seize, it was a moment that called for caution, and the result was predictable. The Neapolitan army was routed, the French set up a republic in Naples, the royal family had to flee.
Mahan really slams this decision, doesn't he?
He does. He talks about the inadequacy to success of merely going ahead unless both time and method are dictated by that martial intelligence, which Nelson so abundantly possessed, but in this case, failed to use. Basically, Nelson let his emotional commitments, his loyalty to the Neapolitan royals and Lady Hamilton override his military judgment.
And this culminated in probably his most serious act of disobedience, right? Refusing Admiral Keith's direct order in July 1799.
Yes. Admiral Lord Keith was now the commander-in-chief in the Mediterranean. He ordered Nelson, quite clearly, to take his squadron from Sicily and go to Minorca, which was a key British base under threat and needed protection. Keith wanted to concentrate his forces.
And Nelson just said no.
Flatly refused. He chose to stay in Sicilian waters to support the counter-revolution and restore the Neapolitan monarchy. He argued that saving Naples was more important to the overall British cause than protecting Minorca, which was Keith's direct responsibility.
So he's basically second-guessing his own C&C's strategic priorities. How did he justify that?
He fell back on his intentions again. He wrote something like, I am so confident of the uprightness of my intentions that, with all respect, I submit myself to the judgment of my superiors. He truly seemed to believe that if his motives were pure serving the king, the cause, then disobeying a direct order, was excusable.
But what's the military verdict on that line of reasoning? Can you run a navy that way?
Mahan is absolutely clear. No military tribunal can possibly accept a man's conscience as the test of obedience. It just doesn't work. If every officer gets to decide which orders align with the greater good based on their personal feelings, the whole system collapses into chaos. Discipline is paramount. Nelson himself, much later, admitted his mistake here, reflecting that he paid more attention to another sovereign than my own.
And knowing he'd crossed that line, knowing he'd prioritized Naples over a direct order from his British superior, that must have eaten away at him, especially given his obsession with duty and honor.
It clearly took a huge toll, physically and mentally. Unlike the calculated risk at St. Vincent, which was about tactical initiative within a battle, this was strategic defiance driven by personal entanglement. His officers noticed how low-spirited he was. Trowbridge wrote, I am really sorry to see your lordship so low-spirited. Nelson himself admitted he was writing in a fever, barely able to stay out of bed. The anxiety, the conflict between his idealized duty and his actions, it was making him ill again. This turmoil really marks the end of the 1790s for him.
Okay, moving into the new century, 1801. The scene shifts completely. We're in the Baltic Sea now, dealing with the armed neutrality of the North Russia, Denmark, Sweden. And Nelson finds himself second in command again. under Sir Hyde Parker.
Yes, Sir Hyde Parker, a much older, more cautious sort of establishment figure. And Nelson, clearly still fragile maybe after the Naples business and his recall, immediately felt slighted, undervalued.
He thought Parker was deliberately sidelining him.
He really did. He was convinced this appointment was a kind of disgrace, that Parker had intentionally run his pen through all that could do me credit or give me support. He felt ignored, not consulted on the plans. He saw his path to glory, that radiant orb, being blocked by, well, bureaucratic inertia or maybe even jealousy.
Being a subordinate again, especially under someone cautious, must have been absolute torture for Nelson, given his personality and his need for action and recognition.
You'd think so. And this is where we see Nelson, the master manipulator, the guy who understood human psychology just as well as naval tactics. He pulls off this incredibly shrewd stratagem, as Mahan calls it, the famous turbo anecdote.
Ah, the fish. I love this story. So what was the thinking? Send the boss a fish.
Pretty much. The fleet was sailing over the Dogger Bank, known for good turbo. An officer mentions they might be able to catch a small, fine one. Nelson instantly latches onto this. Knowing that Parker, the commander-in-chief, is fond of good living, Nelson insists they lower a boat, despite rough seas, just to catch and send this one particular little turbo up to Parker's flagship.
So it wasn't a direct challenge. It wasn't about strategy. It was a personal gesture aimed at Parker's vanity, maybe his comfort.
Exactly. It was pure psychological maneuvering. The gift was unexpected, thoughtful, personal. It suggested a warmth and collegiality that Parker perhaps wasn't showing professionally. And Nelson reported, the turbo, having opened a communication, the effect was wonderful. Parker sent back a polite thank you note, and crucially, started actually consulting Nelson properly. Nelson later bragged, I had gained the victory by a turbo.
Amazing. And getting Parker to actually listen to him was vital, wasn't it? Because it led directly to Nelson getting command of the detached squadron for the riskiest part of the operation, the attack on the Danish fleet anchored at Copenhagen.
Absolutely critical. And that battle itself, Copenhagen, was incredibly dangerous. The Danish defenses were strong, the channel was tricky. Several of Nelson's own ships ran aground early on, the Bellona, the Russell. Nelson, watching from his temporary flagship, the Elephant, was apparently extremely agitated. But Mahan says it wasn't agitation from indecision. It was ardent, animated patriotism panting for glory, which had appeared within his reach and was vanishing from his grasp.
That orb was slipping away again. And this pressure cooker moment gives us probably the single most famous act of disobedience in naval history. Parker's signal.
Right. Sir Hyde Parker, positioned further out, seeing ships aground, fearing unsustainable losses, hoisted signal number 39, which meant leave off action, a direct, unambiguous order to disengage, to retreat.
Nelson seized the signal. Obeying it means failure. Total failure. The Danes win.
So Nelson asks his signal lieutenant to acknowledge the order you have to show you've seen it, but then he asks, crucially, is Norrin 16 his own signal for close action still hoisted? Mind you, keep it so. He knew his own captains, in the thick of it, would likely look to his signal, not Parker's distant one, as long as it was flying.
And then the immortal gesture.
He lifts his telescope to his blind right eye, the one he lost at Calvi, and declares loudly enough for those around him to hear, I really do not see the signal.
It's just brilliant. Part theater, part strategic necessity. He's not technically defying the order, he's just unable to see it. It gives him plausible deniability, and it gives his captains the cover they need to keep fighting the battle.
Nelson knew they were on the verge of winning.
Exactly. Fortune favors the blind eye, you might say. And his thinking after the Danes were effectively crushed was just as smart. He immediately pushed for an armistice, a truce.
Why diplomacy right after winning? Why not just finish them off?
Because he was thinking bigger picture. He didn't want to provoke the Russians unnecessarily. Tsar Paul I was unstable and powerful. By beating the Danes decisively, then immediately offering terms under the threat of annihilation, he achieved the key objective, breaking the armed neutrality without pushing Russia into a wider war against Britain right then. It was a statesman's calculation, understanding the limits of purely military victory.
But once Copenhagen was settled, that classic Nelson impatience kicks right back in, doesn't it? He was desperate to get the fleet moving towards Revel to deal with the Russian fleet there. Oh, absolutely chafing at the bit. He felt the Russians were at our mercy, and Parker was just dithering. He wrote to St. Vincent, I make no scruple in saying that I would have been at Revel 14 days ago. That relentless drive, that intolerance for any delay when he saw an opportunity, it never left him.
This period also really highlights one of his better qualities, though. His incredible loyalty to his men,
Mhm.
especially when their honor was slighted. The City of London affair.
Right. The City of London Corporation, for political reasons, voted official thanks for the army's campaign in Egypt, but deliberately left out thanks for the Navy's victory at Copenhagen. Nelson took this as a personal insult, a direct stigma, not just on him, but on the officers and men who fought and bled with him.
He saw himself as their defender.
Completely. He declared he was the natural guardian of the characters of the officers of the Navy, Army, and Marines who served under him. And he put his money where his mouth was. He refused any personal honors from the city, wouldn't attend dinners, wouldn't accept thanks for later commands until the men of Copenhagen received their proper recognition.
He actually said, "I am fixed never to abandon the fair fame of my companions in dangers." That's powerful stuff.
It really is. It's Nelson using that same fierce energy he used to defend his own spotless character back in the day, but now directing it outwards to protect the collective honor of his team. It's a masterclass in leadership loyalty. So, the final act. It begins after the short-lived Peace of Amiens ends in 1803. Nelson had spent some time ashore, setting up house at Merton Place with the Hamiltons, Sir William and Lady Emma. But even then, he was frustrated. He felt the government, the higher offices of the state, weren't taking his strategic advice seriously.
And this brief time ashore gives us that absolutely crucial anecdote, the one that perfectly captures the whole duality Mahan talks about. His only meeting with the Duke of Wellington.
Yeah, Arthur Wellesley as he was then, Wellington's own account of it is just devastatingly insightful. He said when Nelson first came into the waiting room, he seemed like two quite different men. Initially, Nelson just talked about himself, his battles, his wounds, his fame. Wellington found him so vain and so silly as to surprise and almost disgust me.
That sounds like the Nelson completely driven by the need for recognition, the radiant orb guy.
Exactly, the insecure, needy Nelson. But then Nelson apparently twigged who this quiet, reserved army officer was. He nipped out, found out it was Wellesley, the rising star from India. When Nelson came back into the room, Wellington said the transformation was instant. The vanity just evaporated. Nelson started talking of the state of this country and of the aspect and probabilities of affairs on the continent with a good sense and a knowledge of subjects both at home and abroad that surprised me equally. In fact, he talked like an officer and a statesman.
Incredible. That the silly man was the default setting, but the officer and statesman could be switched on instantly by a real challenge or the presence of someone he respected as an equal.
Precisely. And when war broke out again, it was the officer and statesman who answered the general call to duty. He took up the Mediterranean command once more, despite wanting rest. This was the command that would lead ultimately to Trafalgar.
And this final command, it wasn't just chasing glory, was it? It was his first real taste of the sheer administrative burden of being a commander-in-chief for a long period.
Right. His letters from this time are full of the grind. Constant worries about supplies, food, water, ropes, sails, keeping the men healthy during long blockades, his ships literally wearing out under him. He complained he had but 4 sail fit to keep the sea at one point, and there were no decent repair facilities nearby. A huge part of the job was just logistics, keeping the fleet operational.
But strategically, his mind was sharp as ever. He quickly figured out what the main French plan under Admiral Villeneuve would be. Head for the West Indies with troops. Why was he so sure about that?
Nelson reckoned the French thinking was sound, politically. Capture a few key British sugar islands in the Caribbean, and the merchants and planters back in England would scream so loudly for peace that the British government would humble ourselves. He understood the war was economic and political as much as military. Hurt Britain's trade, forced them to the negotiating table.
So, while blockading Toulon, he tried to lure the French admiral, Latouche-Treville, out into a fight.
Yeah, he deliberately kept only a small part of his force visible, close to Toulon, trying to make himself look like an easy target. He wanted to tempt Treville out, specifically hoping to fight him to leeward of Toulon, so the prevailing winds would help the rest of the British fleet brush the battle and prevent any damaged French ships escaping back into port.
That's a risky strategy, dangling bait like that.
Very Nelson. But Latouche-Treville was cautious, he didn't bite, and then he really infuriated Nelson by publishing this official report claiming he'd chased the British fleet away.
Oh, dear. Nelson wouldn't have liked that.
Hated it. Nelson wrote furiously, "You all have seen Monsieur Latouche's letter of how he chased me and how I ran. I keep it, and by God, if I take him, he shall eat it." That personal pride, that reputation, still absolutely intertwined with his military duty.
But on the personal front, he showed a different kind of strength this time, didn't he? when Lady Hamilton wanted to come out and join him off Toulon.
Yes, this is a marked contrast to the Naples situation. She apparently wanted to come out, maybe even live aboard the Victory. Nelson absolutely refused. He knew it was too dangerous, completely impractical, and it would violate his own standing orders against having women on board his ships during active service.
He wrote to her explaining why.
He did, very tenderly but firmly. Imagine what a cruise off Toulon is. It would kill you, and myself to see you. He prioritized his duty, but framed it in terms of their shared honor. He argued that the call of our country makes it indispensable for both our honors. This time, the public duty, the shared glory, clearly won out over the private desire.
So Villeneuve finally gets out of Toulon in early 1805. Latouche-Treville had died, Villeneuve took over. Nelson misses him initially, but quickly figures out where he's gone.
To the West Indies, just as Nelson predicted. And Nelson's decision to chase him, to follow Villeneuve wherever they went, even to the East Indies, that decision, Mahan says, held the germ of the great campaign of Trafalgar.
Why was that chase so critical, even though he didn't actually catch Villeneuve over there?
Because the speed and sheer relentless determination of Nelson's pursuit completely spooked Villeneuve and the French. Nelson's arrival in the West Indies forced Villeneuve to abandon whatever plan he had and flee back to Europe. So Nelson achieved the strategic goal protecting the British colonies without firing a shot, just by his presence and reputation.
But the strain of that chase, the uncertainty, it took a toll on him again. His diary entries sound pretty bleak.
Yeah, entries like very miserable, which is very foolish, and complaining about the slow progress back across the Atlantic. We crawled 33 miles the last 24 hours. You can feel the immense psychological pressure.
So he gets back to England briefly, then prepares for the final showdown. And just before he sails, there's one last really extraordinary act of, well, kindness, generosity. The Calder controversy.
Right. So Robert Calder had fought an inconclusive action against Villeneuve's returning fleet off Cape Finisterre. The Admiralty recalled Calder for a court-martial, basically for not achieving a decisive victory. Calder was distraught at the prospect of returning home in disgrace, and especially didn't want to leave his flagship, the big 90-gun Prince of Wales.
And Nelson, who desperately needed every single ship, especially heavy ships of the line, for the coming battle with the combined French and Spanish fleet. What did he do?
He let Calder sail home in the Prince of Wales. He gave up a first-rate 90-gun battleship on the eve of Trafalgar, purely out of compassion for a fellow officer facing disgrace.
That seems almost strategically irresponsible, given Nelson's focus on annihilation.
It absolutely flew in the face of his own principle that numbers only can annihilate. He knew he was weakening his fleet. He even wrote to the First Lord of the Admiralty, basically admitting he was disobeying orders by not transferring Calder to a smaller ship. He said, "I may be thought wrong as an officer, but I trust that I shall be considered to have done right as a man, and to a brother officer in affliction, my heart could not stand it." The human element, his empathy, won out over cold military logic. Just astounding.
And then, the final piece, the Nelson Touch Memorandum. The battle plan he issued to his captains before Trafalgar. This is the culmination of everything, isn't it?
It really is. It was revolutionary for its time. Standard naval tactics involved forming this long single line of battle, sailing parallel to the enemy line and just blasting away. It was formal, rigid, designed for control.
But Nelson threw that playbook out.
Completely. The Nelson Touch was all about concentration of force and controlled chaos. He planned to break the long enemy line in two places. One division of his fleet, led by Collingwood, would smash into the rear section of the combined fleet. His own division would attack the enemy center.
The goal being?
The goal was to overwhelm and annihilate the enemy's rear and center before their leading ships, the van, could even turn around and get back into the fight, which, in the light winds expected, would take hours. He was deliberately creating a localized superiority of numbers right at the points of attack.
So it wasn't about maintaining a perfect formation. It was about breaking the enemy's formation and trusting his captains to exploit the confusion.
Exactly. His whole philosophy was in that memo. Something must be left to chance. Nothing is sure in a sea fight beyond all others. He gave them the overall vision annihilation, but he trusted the captains he'd trained, the band of brothers, to use their initiative in the smoke and chaos.
So October 21st, 1805, Trafalgar. The final day brings all the threads together. His last letter to Lady Hamilton, mixing love and duty, found open on his desk.
Yeah, and his meticulous attention to detail right before the battle, warning the gun crews not to waste shots, to be sure of their aim. His absolute insistence on leading the line himself in the victory, refusing to let another ship go ahead, telling Captain Blackwood, "I'll give them such a dressing as they never had before." He had to be first, had to be at the point of maximum danger and glory.
And even after he's mortally wounded, his focus remains absolute. Hearing that 14 or 15 enemy ships were taken, his response.
That as well, I bargained for 20. Still counting, still wanting total victory. And his very last military order, thinking strategically even then about the approaching storm and saving the captured prizes. Anchor! Hardy anchor! He was chasing that radiant orb right to the very end, wasn't he? Making sure the victory was complete, permanent. Even that final order to anchor defied standard practice, which was often to drift after a battle, but he knew anchoring was the only way to save the crippled ships in the coming gale.
So when we look back, Mahan's goal, disentangling the man from the glory, it feels like we get there. You see these two Nelsons running side by side throughout his life. There's the statesman, the commander, incredible strategic insight, relentless energy. Could see the big picture from naval tactics right up to continental strategy and colonial economics.
Right. And then right alongside him is the other Nelson, the emotional, sometimes vain, almost silly man, as Wellington saw him, intensely vulnerable to passion, consumed by that need for praise, for affirmation, the man whose physical health seemed directly tied to whether he was actively pursuing that renown.
It's like his whole career was this cycle. Achieve something amazing, then feel this intense longing for more recognition, and then finding the only real peace, mentally and physically, came from throwing himself back into constant demanding service. That action relieved the anxiety.
Yeah, that tension between the deep personal need for validation and the absolute commitment to public duty, it never really went away. But crucially, in his professional life, duty nearly always won out in the end. Even if, and this is the key point, even if fulfilling that duty meant bending, breaking, or completely ignoring the established rules and hierarchy.
And that's a core contradiction, isn't it? The brilliant subordinate who achieved his greatest triumphs by often subverting the very chain of command he served. Nelson himself said he'd risk his commission, risk everything, for the good cause.
Think about it. Military structures rely on obedience. Absolute obedience is seen as necessary for cohesion, for control, especially in battle. Yet Nelson's defining successes, St. Vincent, Copenhagen, involved calculated disobedience, and his biggest failures, arguably Naples and disobeying Keith, stemmed from letting personal factors override military discipline, but also involved disobeying orders. He seemed to believe his superior knowledge, his upright intention, justified breaking the rules.
He bet his life, his reputation, everything, on the idea that he knew better than his superiors. So the final thought we want to leave you, the listener, with is this. When, if ever, is it justifiable for a brilliant subordinate, whether in the military, in business, in any organization, to unilaterally decide that disobeying a direct order is the right thing to do, the necessary thing to achieve the mission or save the day? He also put his faith in results, not the rulebook. Does the end ever justify the means when it comes to the chain of command? What conditions would have to be met? It's a tough question, and Nelson's life forces us to confront it.